Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexander Marin, and I am a class of '92 graduate and a member of the International Board of Advisors for Tufts University. It is my privilege to open today. I want to first thank all of you for attending this webinar and this virtual book talk of When Time Stopped by my fellow class of '92 graduate, Ariana Neumann, and one of my oldest and greatest friends. I do want to just emphasize that this event has been co-sponsored by the Tufts Latino Alumni Association and the International Committee of the Alumni Council and Tufts Hillel. And thank you to all of the volunteers and everyone who has participated in making this happen. It is an amazing over 130 attendee event today, and it is just a great kickoff to a bunch of other events that are going to be happening in the upcoming months. And I would encourage you all to sign up and to attend and to be part of this virtual community that has really expanded through this terrible thing called COVID, which has some silver linings, which is for us to all be able to participate at Tufts without necessarily having to be on the Somerville Medford campus. To give you an idea, Jabari, who is our tech expert and part of our volunteer group, is going to give you the different websites where you can go to on the chat side that you can refer to see these future events. There's a bunch of other events that are happening. I think there's one in a couple of weeks, and then there's another like homecoming event in October that you should all be looking for. Let me give you a little bit of a brief outline of what today's activity is. Basically, we are going to ask our professor, Barbara Grossman, to host an interview with Ariana on her book. This event should mostly be the two of them talking about the material, and then we will open it up for a Q&A session about 35-40 minutes into the event so that all of you can ask your questions. I would ask that you ask all those questions on the chat so that Professor Grossman can see them and read them, and Ariana can then take her time and answer them fully and completely. Before we get going, I do want to introduce our two stars of today. I will start by introducing Ariana Neumann, who I have known for a very, very long time. I'll leave it at that, although you can do the math if she's a class of '92. Ariana was born and raised in Caracas, Venezuela, to, as if you've read the book, an immigrant father from Eastern Europe, and an amazing mom. She has a BA in history and French literature and a master's degree in Spanish and Latin American literature from another school a little south of Tufts, and then a graduate degree in psych and religion from the University of London, which is the city in which she now lives with her husband and three beautiful kids. Ariana is someone who has been very curious her whole life and always interested in art and literature and just the human condition as a whole. And this first book of hers is, I think, the result of that effort. It is a beautiful book if you haven't read it. You do have to buy it. You can't just have your friends give it to you because, of course, she is a graduate of art school, and we want to give her as much of that money as she can get from that book, so please buy the book. When Time Stopped is her first book, but I can tell you that the concept of time stopping, I think, anecdotally for us, was amazing during those 3 or 4 years together at Tufts. A lot of things have happened, a lot of things we did together, a lot of people that we met, and a lot of different moments in life. You know, from breakfasts on Sunday that we used to get to when we could, and it was really, really cold. She'll remember getting in my little shitty 1982 Volkswagen Rabbit, which was the only car that started of our three cars, the three of us that used to eat breakfast together on Sundays. And just in general, just an amazing experience of being able to join both international communities as well as you know, the American students and the local Boston students who were there. It was just a great experience. I think the one event that I will mention very briefly is the time that I invited her as my date to the Tufts rugby banquet, which turned out to be in this little crappy Chinese restaurant. And we used to have to sign up as another organization because the previous year we had ruined the place through the banquet. So those were always really fun things. It is a privilege to have you, Ariana, on this panel, and the book that you have written is just, for me, very, very personal because I am a grandson of a Holocaust survivor, and it's just an amazing recounting of the trials and tribulations of somebody who had to go through some very, very difficult ordeals in order to survive and then flourish and then become one of the greatest supporters of art in Venezuela and in Latin America. So welcome, Nadia. Professor Grossman has been a professor at Tufts and in the Department of Dance and Performance since 1991. So she was there when we were there. Always a privilege to know that there are professors who have endured the test of time at Tufts. She is a theater historian and a voice specialist, and also is a person who is an avid, I think, kind of curious person around the Holocaust and genocide-related theater and film. And so the pairing of the two for today is, I think, very, very appropriate and very, very valuable. Professor Grossman also was able to introduce Ariana at the Boston event that was held for the book. So that's also kind of a twofer on this. I want to thank both of you for joining us. And in particular, I want to thank all 100 and something of you online who are joining us. And I will now hand it over to Professor Grossman to tell us about the book with Ariana. Thank you, guys.
Speak with Ariana today and to know that you're all there and are eager to hear about it too. So I want to begin. This book is beautifully written. It's meticulously researched. It's part biography, part memoir, and it reads like a spy thriller. When I read it for the first time, I was so drawn in, captivated, but I kept turning the pages. I mean, it could easily have been historical fiction, except that it's all true. It begins on the first page with a question mark, literally, where you say you're in Prague in 1997, you're a tourist, you're at the Pincus Memorial, which is an old synagogue in Prague, and on one of the walls with names of Holocaust, people who were Czech victims of the Holocaust, you see your father's name. You see your father's name, Hannes Stanislav Neumann, with his birth date, but he's the only person on the sea of 70,000 names, 77,000 plus names, with no death date, only a question mark. And then you segue to Caracas, where, as Alex said, you grew up, where you were the daughter of wealthy parents, kind of glamorous parents, in a grand house with a lush garden, a striking contemporary art collection, and many, many secrets and unanswered questions. So I'd like you to begin with that, if you would. Would you tell us about your childhood, your sense that your mother and father were not like other parents, and that your family and you were somehow different?
Absolutely. Well, it's a joy to be here. Thank you, Barbara, for doing this again, coping with me a second time. And Alex, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And that rugby Chinese dinner was one of the happiest memories of my Tufts experience. So I grew up, I had an absolutely blissful childhood. It was luminous, vibrant. It was filled with just joy and happiness. I was in a Venezuela, which is nothing like the Venezuela now. It was filled with potential. And my father was a very successful immigrant. He was a bit of a Renaissance man. He was an industrialist, but he was involved in universities and in museums and in all sorts of art pursuits, and even started a design school in newspapers. And all I knew as I was growing up was that he had emigrated from Prague in 1949. He was 50 by the time I came along. And he was very engaged in the present. He was very excited by the now and by the future, but he never ever spoke about the past. So my house was in the middle of the city in Caracas. It was beautiful. It was surrounded by tropical lush gardens. And I was raised as an only child. I have half brothers, but I was on my own in the house. And as one does when you have a garden and you have no internet, I set up a detective club with my friends and my cousins. And little did I know that the biggest mystery I would solve was that of my father. And I think even when I was a little girl, there were clues that that something was not right, that there was something that jarred with this blissful, vibrant life that we led. And I think the first thing that really shook me and made me realize that there was a mystery there was one of those afternoons where the detectives and we had a club called the Mysterious Boot. We were spying on my father, and one of my cousins reported that my father had moved a box, very much like, you see, very much like this one, as a matter of fact. And inside that box, I found an ID card, and it was an ID card. It was a pink ID card, and it had a photograph of my father. And I recognized it, even though he was obviously in the picture a very young man. It was a black and white picture. So my father, by the time I found it, which was 1980, had a very wrinkled face, but I recognized those eyes. And what astounded me was that in the part that it said name, it didn't say my father's name. It said Jan Sebesta. My father was called Hans Neumann. And in the part where it said date, the date was a little off. So he was born he was born on February the 9th, 1921. And this card said birth date was the 3rd, was 3/11, so the 11th of March, 1921. So that was a little off. And that terrified me. And I actually ran to my mother that day and said, this man who we're living with is not at all who he says he is. He's an imposter. So I think I knew. And then there were also other clues. So, I mean, this particular incident of finding the ID card brought to the fore all these other little cracks, which I think I had sort of glossed over before. There were nightmares. So he would wake up screaming in a language I didn't understand. There was absolutely no talk of family, of what my father had left behind. As far as I knew, my father had one brother, and that was it. And if I asked any questions about his parents or about the family or about Prague, they were all met with a wall of silence. And every so often there was a little bit of a shaking of the hands. So that was, I think, my childhood. I don't know, Barbara, if that's sort of...
Sure, it is. It's fine, because I'm so glad you mentioned your mysterious boot, the club, and how you wanted to, you said at one point you wanted to be a doctor, then you wanted to be a spy, a detective, but you said what you really wanted to do was to solve mysteries, not knowing at that time that the mystery you would solve would be the mystery of your father's life. And I'd like to ask you to come back to that box that you found when you were 8, because then the box disappeared. You never saw the box again growing up, and you went off to college, as we've heard, and you got married, and you're living in London. So now just fast forward to 2011, and your father, you are pregnant, you've had your first child, your father dies, and you cannot go to the funeral because you've just given birth, or because you were pregnant. But anyway, you go to Venezuela. And could you tell us what happens there when you return to Venezuela and you are charged with dealing with whatever possessions your father left?
My father was a collector of things. He collected everything you can think of. He collected watches. He had 297 of those. He was obsessed by those. But he collected art, and he was incredibly meticulous. So he kept every little piece of paper that anyone had ever given him, whether it was a receipt or whether it was a letter. He had files on people, and he had just 2 rooms filled with these files. So I had assumed that it would take me at least a couple of weeks to go through all these papers, to go through all these files. And I walked into his study and opened the first drawer, and it was completely empty. And then I opened another one, and it was completely empty. And I panicked, and he had a woman who had sort of been his assistant for a very long time. And I said, what's happened to everything? And she said, we've cleared it all out. All he's left is in one drawer. And it was basically a file with letters from me to him, and from my mother to him. He had thrown all the other letters away, and he had left me that box, that same box I had found as a child detective with, I don't know if you can see it there, but that's the ID card. And that's a picture of my father, and that's the part where it says Jan Sebesta. And so it had that, and it was, which was, of course, the same card, exactly the same card that I had found, but it was crammed with papers. And it was crammed with papers in German from Berlin, and from what I know now to be his astonishing choice to go and hide in plain sight in Berlin, which was particularly remarkable because he was a Jew from Prague who was wanted by the Gestapo. So that's when I figured I had the permission to solve the mystery of my father, to really dig into, to travel back into the past, to dig around, to ask questions. And I didn't do it immediately because I was having little kids and I didn't think I could sort of delve into the Holocaust and, you know, tell fairy tales to my children at night. So it took me a little while, but it took me about 10 years to piece it all together. And I went on this remarkable journey where I found family I didn't know I had, where I traced friends, or where they're friends now, but the children of friends of the family who who risked their lives to save my father's life and indeed to help the rest of the family. So it's been an absolutely incredible journey, all thanks to this box, really.
So Ariana, thank you for sharing that. And I want to ask you, because, you know, it's easy when you give a retrospective account to just kind of compress 10 years of really hard work. And I know from the book that you were initially reluctant. You weren't sure what you were going to find. You also didn't know Czech. And you, in the course of your research, you discovered this extended network of family that you never knew. You couldn't have known them because of the 34 people that you discovered through your work. 25 of them were murdered in the Holocaust. And what is so extraordinary about your father's story, which started to tell us now, is that you mentioned a couple of times as a child, because he was prone to falling and other assorted mishaps, that he was referred to as the unfortunate boy. But this unfortunate boy became a very lucky man, or I would say a very resourceful and determined man. Is the story that you tell, he managed to escape deportation from the Nazis 3 times. I mean, who does that? When you think of the millions of people called for roundup and deportation, 3 times he escaped. So I think part of it is his own bravery and resourcefulness and will to survive, but also the people who were willing to help him, the non-Jewish people who were willing to help him, particularly his childhood best friend, and if I'm mispronouncing the name, Stenek, and also his sister-in-law, who was married to his brother Lothar. The sister-in-law was also not Jewish, and her name was Stenka. And she does something remarkable in its own right. So can you just tell people about more of this incredible story? Because again, if you read it without knowing it was true, you'd say, oh, this could never have happened. No, people just couldn't do that.
I know, it was incredible. And it's actually often when I told the story, even when I went to different museums and to experts of the Holocaust, they would go, yes, yes, whatever. And then I'd pull out the documents and then I'd pull out these accounts. So everybody that was involved with the story, and this is incredibly lucky for me, kept an account. Either they wrote a little bit of a memoir as they got older, or they kept papers. So as I went through these 10 years, all these other boxes started arriving, including one with letters that were snuck out of the prison camp of Terezin, just outside of Prague. And the reason they were snuck out of the camp was because this incredibly brave and beautiful woman called Stenka, who was married to my uncle Lothar, who was slightly older than my father. And you have to imagine Stenka. She is stunningly beautiful. She is bright, she's intelligent, she's independent. She is studying law, she drives her own car, and she could have anyone she wanted. I mean, in terms of everything really. And she chooses to marry my uncle, who is Jewish, and she chooses to marry him in 1939, which is just a remarkable thing to do. But even more remarkable is the fact that she, as the net tightens around the family and they lose their belongings, she was independently wealthy because her father had built these beautiful residential buildings all around Prague, so she collected rent from them. And she had access to money, which was crucial to my family because obviously the Nazis took everything. So a lot of them were literally starving or didn't have access to medicines. And Stenka would ferry around all the different family members and take them letters and take them food and take them medicine. But when my grandmother is deported first, and this is a little unusual because generally speaking, families were deported together, but my family tried to beat the system. So when the first transportation notice arrived in May 1942, it had my grandmother's name, my grandfather's name, and my father's name. Lothar, my uncle, was saved because he was married to a non-Jew. So if you were in a mixed marriage, you were temporarily protected. And my grandfather and my father tried to get everyone off the transport list. They had heard this was really, you know, you didn't want to be in a transport. And they succeeded in getting my father and Otto, I mean, my grandfather off, but my grandmother went alone. So my grandmother goes in May 42. She is in a transport that is meant to go to Sobibor, where on arrival, everybody in that transport was shot. But she faints in the transport just before arrival in Theresienstadt. So she's taken off the transport, which is one of the first miracles actually in my grandmother's life, because that gives her a few more years. And the family don't really know where she is until August. And then in August, news comes out from the council in Prague that Ella, my grandmother, is in Theresienstadt. And Stenka, this wonderful, brave, beautiful woman, thinks that the obvious thing to do is to go and see her. So she sneaks into the camp of Theresienstadt. She dresses up like someone who would have been working in the fields in the camp. So she puts sort of her older clothes on. She sews a yellow star on her coat. And when the people working in the camps go out to the fields, she joins them. And then when they come in at lunchtime, she sneaks in with them into the camp, finds my grandmother, and brings her, I think she brings her a shawl, and I think she brings her some lipstick, and she brings her actually love and hope. And I have this beautiful letters. So because I have my grandparents' letters, I've sort of gotten to know them really, and I feel them incredible. I mean, it's wonderful because I obviously knew I had grandparents, but they were never spoken about. So it's a real gift to have these letters. And in the first letter that my grandmother sneaks out of the camp, because Denka then figures out a way of sneaking contraband into the camp. And the person that sneaks the contraband in brings out these beautiful letters from my grandmother and my grandfather. So the first letter from my grandmother says, I had been so depressed. This is a miserable, dark place. And when I saw Stenka, I you know, it was the first time I realized that, you know, there was light and there was hope. And we just held each other's hands. And it's sort of wonderful because I have Stenka's account. She wrote a little bit about it too. And then I have my grandmother's, and they absolutely marry up. And you realize that they were both just so buoyed by this meeting. So Stenka does that. And then obviously it's very risky. So she doesn't do it on a regular basis, but she does do it again in 1944. Once my grandfather has been deported too, she sneaks into it again just to take much needed shoe polish, because my grandfather had a head full of white hair, which everyone in my family always said, or in my father's family always said to them that it made them very distinguished. But in the eyes of the Nazis, of course, it meant that they were old. And if you were old, you were useless. And if you were useless, you went to the gas chambers. So this shoe polish to dye my grandfather's hair, I mean, it was initially hair dye, but as the war went on, it became shoe polish, was absolutely crucial. And when things were difficult and the couriers were, you know, feared for their lives and didn't want to actually bring in the goods, Stenka went in again and snuck in.
You know, one of the things that I love about your book, one of the many things, is the way you interweave different voices and different narratives so beautifully, and how, you know, it's your story, but it's your father's story and it's your family's story. And I would love to, I love the way you really let your father's voice take over and tell about his story in Berlin. Could you read the passage in the book where he's on the train from Prague to Berlin, where he's now escaped being rounded up for the third time, and he's made the decision to hide in plain sight in Berlin?
Of course. So in that box that I just showed you, where I found the ID card, my father also, at some stage in 91 and 92, he tried to write a retrospective diary at his time in Berlin. And he wrote about a few dozen pages, well, a few dozen, actually 20 pages, which again gave me enough material to then include his voice into the book. So I'm going to start a little bit with my voice, so you just get a sense, for those that haven't read the book, of what the book is like. I now know that, oh, sorry, and the reading takes about 5 minutes, so I'm just warning you in case, I don't know, in case you think it's going to take 15 or 1. So I now know that my father took the night train to Berlin on May the 3rd, 1943, the Elite 147 that departed Hebrnsky Station in Prague at 1:44 a.m. and arrived in Berlin nearly 8 hours later. In the spring of 2018, I traveled alone along the same route. It takes 4.5 hours today, and there is no longer a night train. Even if there had been, I would not have been brave enough to take it. I bought a ticket for the noon train on a May morning. The tracks trace the same path out of Prague as they did in 1943. To my surprise, as the train left the suburbs and curled along the wooded banks of the Vltava River to my right, I passed through the town of Lipčice. From the large carriage windows, I could clearly see the roof, balcony, and casements of my grandparents' country house, where my father had spent countless childhood weekends. The train then headed north, weaving along the course of the river, and came within a kilometer of Terezin itself before crossing the Czech border and pushing on to Dresden. Then, finally, it reached Berlin. I followed my father's route 75 years after his journey, almost to the day, clutching copies of the papers that he had left me. As I made that pilgrimage, I hoped that the night on which my father traveled was moonless, and that, in his fear, he did not notice his parents' house unlit as the train rolled onwards, that he did not know just how very close he was to them in the blackness, just south of Terezin. I hoped that he felt me cradling him, holding his hand, across the worlds of time and experience that then and now lay between us. This is what my father wrote about that journey. The train did not illuminate the tracks. The carriages were dark. The dim light of the aisles only allowed you to see the coming shadows, the delineations of figures moving. The shells of bodies slumped. I could hear the sound of the train incessantly rumbling and churning. There were 5 others in my compartment, their faces hidden like mine. The darkness is why I chose this train, this hour. It must have been close to dawn, 4 hours since we had left Prague. Passengers sitting and swaying with the movement of the train, our faces shrouded by our coats that hung from bronze hooks. The others might have slept, but I couldn't. I was too afraid. We were close to the German border now. I touched the passport in my left pocket, the one with a permit to cross the border that Stenka had sourced. In my other, I had the identity card that Mila had given me. We had used a chemical to carefully erase the names and mix the inks to match the color of the rest of the text. It now read Jan Sebesta, chemist, born in Alt-Bunzlau on March 11th, 1921. Only the passport had the name Zdeněk Tuma. I prayed the identity check would be quick in this compartment, a swift formality. Mila was the one who finally convinced Zdeněk. Things were awful enough, and no one wanted to take unnecessary risks, so to have this passport was a miracle. Helping me meant that they were both risking their lives. Zdeněk had not wanted to let me down, but he was terrified for his sake and for mine. He was scared that I couldn't pull it off. My main worry was the photo in Zdeněk's passport. Zdeněk's face was much thinner and more angular than mine, and his eyes, like clever piercing darts, were unlike my large green ones. You have the dreamy eyes of an artist, my mother had always said. The train stopped. I heard voices that I assumed to be the conductor and the border police. I took the thin glass vial covered in brown rubber from my pocket and placed it at the back of my mouth. I was told it would take only a few seconds, a minute at most. Cyanide poisons your nerves, so the brain dies first, and then the heart. Passports, a German voice said. They were not asking for other papers, just passports. In the darkened carriage, the handheld beam lit up each passport held by every extended hand. I pretended to be asleep. The guard shook me. I kept my face hidden beneath the coat, my eyes half closed. My hand moved the coat a few centimeters to show deference and offered him the passport. He looked at it for a few seconds. I was certain that he must be able to see my heart pounding in my chest. Danke schön, mein Herr, he muttered as he closed it and handed it back. I waited a few seconds to make sure they were gone. The train heaved forward and I was able to breathe again. I coughed and spat the ampoule into my hand. I placed it carefully back in my pocket. I would need it again. I slept until we pulled into the station in Berlin. It was mid-morning. I placed the passport in an envelope which I addressed to Zdeněk at the Central Post Office in Prague. If I was caught now, there would be no more danger to Zdeněk. The warming sunlight shone in between the buildings as I stepped outside. Suddenly, my briefcase felt very light. It was a beautiful spring day in Berlin in May 1943, the 4th year of the Second World War. Berlin. There I was, now Jan Sebesta, a Czech chemist, looking for a job and a room to rent.
Oh, that is so powerful. Thank you for sharing that exquisite passage. I wanted to ask you about the title of your book, because titles, as we all know, are thoughtfully chosen and extremely significant. You called it When Time Stopped, a memoir of my father's war and what remains. So I wanted to ask you to talk about the meaning of the title and the importance of time as a central theme of your memoir, but I also want to tack onto that. So time, but then in her very positive New York Times review, the critic in April who reviewed your book called your book, she said, she praised it for functioning on multiple levels, you know, that yes, your account of one Jewish Czech family's race to outwit the Nazis makes for thrilling reading, but just as important is Neumann's lucid investigation of the nature of memory, identity, and remembrance. So I guess I'd love it if you, and this will be my last question before we open it up to questions from the attendees, but if you could just talk about time as a theme, but also what she's just said, the nature of memory, identity, and remembrance as they play out in your book.
Of course. So I have to tell you the title was originally not When Time Stopped. It was The Shadow Beneath the Candle. And it was The Shadow Beneath the Candle because there's a Czech saying that says, if you're going to hide somewhere, you don't hide in the periphery where the light of the candle is going to give you away. You go and hide in the center of it all. You go and hide where it is darkest, in the middle of the shadow, just underneath the candle, because then no one will look for you, no one will find you. So that was the original title. This was such a personal journey, and it didn't start off as a book. So to put a title to it, for me was sort of impossible. And then my agent actually said it has to be called The Shadow Beneath the Candle. And then when Scribner in the US bought the book, they said, no, too long, too confusing. And then I'm really lucky that a wonderful Boston writer, a novelist called Claire Massoud, was the first person to give me a blurb, and which is just a positive review of the book. And she said, love the book. Title is really long and weird, and I can't remember what it's called. So they seized onto that and they said, what else can we call it? And then the head of Scribner said, I think we should do something with time. And we agreed it should be when time stopped. Little do we know there was going to be a pandemic and time was really going to stop for us all. But time is important for so many reasons. I mean, this book really it was about my personal journey into the past. So time stopped for me. And not only did it stop, but it reversed, because I got these grandparents that I never met, that I never heard about, and that all of a sudden I could see and I could meet through their own words, because I have these very candid letters that they wrote to their children, and they wrote not knowing if each letter was going to be the last. So time is important because of that. And of course, I'm very secondary to the story, but time stops for my grandparents, where they're interned in Terzin. They're isolated. They don't know what's going to happen next. They're separated from those that they love. Time stops for my father over and over and over again. And actually, this book is many things, but really what it is a homage to my father. And he loved watches, and he was absolutely obsessed with them. And I think I mentioned he had 297 of them. And whenever he wasn't, starting a business or involved in something interesting, like creating a museum or helping with the educational system in Venezuela, or involved in charitable work, he would repair watches, and he would make sure that these 297 watches all kept time, which was tricky because none of them were quartz watches. You had to sort of wind them up and make sure that they were working. So the concept of time is key to this book, because I guess through my journey I realized actually that time is not a linear progressive thing, but it's something that we can travel in. So I do a little bit of time traveling, not in a sci-fi way. So sorry guys if you're looking for a sci-fi book, but I do go back and meet these people. And I also, more importantly, meet my father as a young man. And I realized that my father as a young man is not at all the father I meet when I come along, and he's 50 years old, because that father I meet is absolutely punctual and obsessed with watches and obsessed with time, and presumably he's trying to recuperate his time as well, and that is why he is so obsessed with watches. But and I explain it in the book at some stage. When I was a little girl, I went up to him and said, "Can you please tell me why you're so obsessed with watches? When did it start? Were you obsessed with watches as a little boy?" And he said, "No, I became obsessed with watches at some stage in my life where time had stopped." And I now know that that was probably when my father was in hiding, right before he decided to go and take that train journey to Berlin, where for 2 months he couldn't make a sound, and he was in a tiny makeshift room under a false wall in a working factory. And time slowed down as he couldn't move and do anything, to the point that he thought it had stopped. So he opened his watch, and he found great reassurance in the mechanism working and ticking that made him realize that time was indeed passing. So that's time. Memory, memory is, what can I tell you about it? Memory is what makes us. I think we're our stories, we're the stories of those that came before us. And memories, they're images, but we share our memories with words. And I think it's just so important to use words and language, and to tell stories, and to figure out, especially in these times where language is often used to separate and stereotype, and just divide us. I think it's so important that we use words to build bridges and to find what it is that unites us. So I think we need to go through the memories of those that came before us and tell the stories. not only because it binds us, but also, I think when we read history, we're given data and numbers, and those are key, of course. But people forget numbers. So I think it's key, or at least I forget numbers, maybe because I'm not very good at maths. I think it's key to humanize that data. I think it's key to give faces and feelings and names to those people. Because actually, I generally think people forget numbers, but they don't forget stories. So I don't know if that, I didn't really talk about memories too much, but.
No, I think it was a perfect answer. And I actually would love to follow up with a question, but I had said that I'd ask my last before we go into Q&A. So I have one final question that I'll ask at the end if there's time, but I would like to go to some questions from our audience. So these are actually two questions from Yvonne, and I will pose them both. First, she asked, what happened to your grandparents? So that's the first question. But then she says, my family has unsolved Holocaust mysteries. An Austrian Nazi stationed in The Hague enabled their escape. We don't know who he was. How did your own identity change?
Okay. So how did my own identity change? It changed in so many ways, and I'm asked this over and over, and there's, I could go on for days telling you about it. I think it's a little bit like when you're a parent, and it's all very. You have to remember that this is all very, very new, and I'm still solving mysteries, and I'm still finding people, and I had someone the other day who called me up and said, oh, this part of your book, I know who it is. That was. My father at some stage starts passing off information from this factory that he's working in Berlin to a member of the Dutch resistance. And he says, I know who the Dutch student is. So I'm still piecing it all. And it's a little bit like when you have a child, you become a parent, and you know that your world has been intrinsically changed. You know it. You feel it in every single pore. But you don't quite understand it because you see this little bundle of a baby and you don't quite understand it. And I think it's not until they're sort of, 30 or 25 that you really can put words to what it is to being a parent. So I feel a little bit like that. This is still a very sort of young baby, and I have been intrinsically changed. I feel completely different. I always felt out of place. In Venezuela, I always felt out of place. I went to a Catholic school. I feel very out of place there. And maybe it's the nature of the family that I come from. But I now feel much more like I know why that is. So I'm not sure I feel more like I'm in the right place, but I certainly feel like I understand why it is that I always felt displaced, like I always felt like I didn't belong where I was born. And I don't think I answered her first question. Can you remind me?
Yes, what happened to your grandparents?
Oh, okay. Now I know why I didn't answer the question.
Yeah.
My grandparents were transported to Theresienstadt. They managed to avoid being transported east for 2 years. But eventually, in the fall of 44, as the Germans were losing the war, they were both separately transported to Auschwitz, and that's where they finished their days. So it was, when I first found out the date my grandfather was transported, I just kept thinking, oh my goodness, he just needed to live for 3 months and then he would have been liberated. But it wasn't to be. But at least I have their letters. So I now understand both why my father couldn't speak about them, about my family, about his family. But I feel hugely privileged to have their letters and to have got a little glimpse of who they were, really.
And I was very moved that you said that you went to every place that they lived and worked as part of your journey of discovering and reclamation. It's very moving. Okay, this is a question from Jane, who asks, how did your dad end up in Venezuela? Was your mom Venezuelan? Did your parents meet in Venezuela? Did your mom know your dad's story?
So my mother is Venezuelan. Her family's been there since, I don't know, I'm going to get it wrong and they're going to get angry, but I think 1811, might have been 17 something, but a really long time. I look like my father, I guess. My mother and him met in Venezuela. My mother had then was divorced, and they met in the 60s. My mother was working for a dance company called Merce Cunningham. My father was sponsoring Merce Cunningham. So they met then. It was a marvelous love affair. They loved each other deeply, and they had me in 1970. They were, I think, it was impossible for my father really, after all this damage was done to him, to have healthy relationships, I guess. And my mother knew a little bit of the story in that she knew, if it was a drawing, she just knew the rough delineations of it. She didn't know the details. So she knew he had lived under a false identity. She didn't know for how long. She didn't know any of the details. She didn't know that he had to be a firefighter when he was there. So that when the bombs were raining in Berlin, the Allies were bombing Berlin, of course, and everybody was going into the shelters, my father was forced to go out and help people. But she didn't know that. There were lots of details that she didn't know. And I think, I think we always pick the people that we need in life. And I think my father needed to forget his past. And my mother is one of these people who is just, again, like him, very focused on the present and the future and not too interested in what's gone before. So presumably why I'm so interested in what's gone before, because it was never talked about. So, and I just think it makes us who you are. But I don't know. My mother's very, she's been wonderful on this journey. And I think it's been a huge journey of discovery for her too. They divorced when I was a teenager. So, but she's been incredibly supportive and has been a lot of what I've uncovered has been a huge surprise.
Thank you, Ariana. We have a question here from David. Since publishing your extraordinarily wonderful account of your father's family, have you learned the answers to any questions still in the book? Such as, do you know who was the colleague he met with in the Berlin cafeteria? I think he was involved in a bombing. It's a question.
So the colleague, I'm still investigating. I know a little bit more about him, and apparently the Dutch student was a pseudonym, and he was actually a British spy. But I'm doing a little bit more research into that, and I hope to find out more about it actually. But I think I think that's. I'm trying to think what other things I've uncovered. I think that's the biggest question for me in the book was exploring that part. But of course, it was the hardest to do. And I tried not to, it's the only part, every story that I put in the book was substantiated by at least 2 different sources. This is, of course, a memoir. It's not a history book, but I tried to be as historically accurate as I could be, given that we're dealing with people's memories and we remember things as we want to remember them, and we color them as we want to color them. So it was the story of the Dutch boy only came from my father. So I had a little bit more about him from my father, but I didn't include it because I wanted to find other sources, and the book deal came in very quickly. They wanted the book very quickly, and I didn't have time to do the research. But I'm still the detective at heart, so I'm still investigating.
Ariana, are you up for a few more questions? Because we have a few more, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people
thank you so much.
In the chat.
Well, these are now in the Q&A because we've exhausted the chat. So here are some from Q&A. This is from Judy. How do you identify now as a Venezuelan, a German, a Czech Jew, an expat living in London?
Right. So I am a Venezuelan Czech Brit who feels very Jewish, although I am not religious. And I'm definitely an expat. I feel a little bit like, I feel a little bit like a refugee, even though I'm not, obviously, but I'm my country Venezuela is a mess, and I'm very lucky that Britain has adopted me, mostly because even though I feel Czech, I don't speak Czech, and it's very difficult. I've been trying to learn the language. It's very, very difficult. So I'm very grateful to Britain for taking me in. And yes, so yes, I feel Jewish. And one person who interviewed me actually very early on said to me, "Do you feel Jewish? Because of course you're not. Your mother isn't." And I wanted to just whack them. I got so angry. I felt like saying, "Come on." But I understand that actually for Orthodox Jews, I'm not Jewish. But I figure, how could I not be when 25 members of my family were killed for being Jewish? How could I not embrace it? And it's such a wonderful ancestry to have.
I feel that you sort of answered this next question, but let me pose it to you. This is from an anonymous attendee.
Mm-hmm.
How has this experience changed you? And relatedly, have you found that your response to anti-Semitic acts today has changed since writing this book?
So the experience has changed me in every possible way. Actually, one of the things that it's also done, and I don't think I spoke about this before, was it's actually made me understand and forgive, not that there was anything really to forgive, but it's made me understand my father so much more, and it brought me much closer to him. So it's ironic that I feel closer to him now. And we had a lovely relationship when he was alive, but I feel closer to him now than I did probably even then. And it's not just writing the book. It's been the research has been very gradual, but I'd like to think that any racism or anti-Semitism or any hate and hatred of the other has always horrified me. But I really feel it in every possible cell. When people are anti-Semitic, and it's not just horrendous acts that are atrocious, but it's also the language that we use. It's incredibly insidious, and it's made me much more in tune to that, and it scares me because people that I believe to be educated and should know better often use stereotypes, and I think that's dangerous.
For sure. Ariana, these are two questions which I'm going to combine, both from an anonymous attendee. I don't know if it's the same one, but how do you reconcile your feelings about the fact that your father seemingly wanted you to find this information, but didn't share it while he was alive? So that's question one. And then what would your father have thought about you sharing his life story?
Right. So, I'm going to start with the first one. So my father, I think, wanted me, I don't know if he wanted me to write a book, but he wanted me to know his life story. And I think some part of him thought it was quite interesting and remarkable. And that's why he wrote it down. And we had talked very briefly, just when I was about 22, I was talking to him about how I wanted to be a writer. And he had shown me one page of his memoir. So it's the first page of his train ride to Berlin. And he had said to me, he wrote in Spanish, and his Spanish was his fourth language. So he wasn't the most fluid writer in Spanish. So he said to me, will you please edit it and we'll do it together. So I think he wanted me to share his life story. He could have easily disposed of all the papers, and as he did everything else, and he didn't. And he knew that it would be for me to find because there was no one else. And it's very easy for me to reconcile the feelings. The fact that my father didn't share the story with me is, I obviously wish he had, but I have to understand that when you go through a trauma like he did, and not only do you lose 25 members of your family and you lose your parents, but you also survive, and you survive by pretending to be someone else and working in a Nazi factory and literally having to become someone else and adopt a new identity. You're so traumatized that to expect someone that's gone through that, no matter how much they love you, to be able to share that with you is impossible. And actually, maybe because they love you so much, they cannot share that with you because they want to protect you. So that's how I reconcile it.
No, I think that's very true. And, you know, you hear of many Holocaust survivors, well, survivors of any genocide, not just the Holocaust, who cannot talk about their experiences until finally they do speak, and some never do. But I love that your father trusted you, believed in you, and knew that you could be his voice, that you could tell his story. And I think that's such a gift, not only from him to you, but from you to him, that he knew that in you, he had his voice, and that you would be the one to bring his story to the world in a very eloquent way, which you certainly have. So I have a question that I know you can answer because I asked you this recently myself. This is from Debbie, who asks, what is your next book?
I'm working on it. I'm doing masses of research, and I'm not sure I'm allowed to say it because I don't know, this person that calls it themselves my agent might kill me. But it's about, it's an incredible story that everybody should know about, and they don't. And it's about refugees. It's set in 1940. It's about how we treat refugees, and what we do when we believe government hype and when we believe scaremongers, sorry, it's sort of a difficult word there. So it's all I can tell you is that it involves a boat, which is ironic because I get very seasick. So, but it's a remarkable story of I think three people. And anyways, I can't tell you anymore, but I'm really excited by it.
Thank you, Ariana. I guess this would probably be the last question because I know we're 1:57 and we're supposed to stop at 2. This is a question again from an anonymous attendee. Will you expose your children to the story that you've told? Will you expose and help your kids understand their heritage?
Yes, absolutely. So my children, you know, they want to kill me, I think, because they have lived the last 10 years with me. So my oldest is 18. So from the time that he was 8, they've gone through this journey with me. They've gone to Theresienstadt with me. I didn't go with them to Berlin because I wanted to do that alone. But they've, you know, we talk about it all the time. We talk about Judaism. We've talked about it with lots of friends who are religiously observant, and we are just arranging things. That COVID delayed it all a little bit, but I want them to talk to a rabbi, and it's all complicated by the fact that my husband is an atheist Church of England person, so we're all a real mix. But I'm proud to say that my children, which is rather remarkable considering the mix, all seem to win all the religious studies prizes in their schools every year. You know, they're not necessarily doing sort of maths and English every year, but they get the religious study and the philosophy prize. So we must be doing something right, I hope.
I am sure. This is one last question, and it's for me. And I hope that you won't mind if I end with this. But my question is, what do you hope your readers will take away from your book? What would you like them to learn? How do you think your father's story and your own can be relevant in this present uncertain moment that we're all grappling with?
Oh, you know, I want them to understand that, you know, this is after everything is said and done, and you go into the past, and you see all these horrors. What survives and what remains is beauty. It's love. It's those things that bind us. It's actually, ironically, what allows my grandparents to survive for 2 years is focusing, both of them quite differently, on the beauty within this darkness, on the light within the darkness, and that enables them to have hope. And I think actually that's a very important lesson in life. I think when things get dark and you're isolated and you can't make plans because you don't know what's going on, and people around you are suffering and you're suffering yourself, you just need to sort of let go of control a little bit. And that was much easier for my grandmother, I think, than it was for my grandfather, who was obsessed with controlling things. But they both managed to do it, and they both managed to focus on the moment and find joy in the tiny little things that made their life perhaps a tiny little bit better. So for my grandfather, at some stage, it's a dumpling that someone drops that's covered in dirt. But actually to him, when he picks it up, means that he's having two dumplings and it tastes absolutely blissful. And for my grandmother, it's literally just seeing all these beautiful flowers spring up in the middle of the camp. And those remind her of the flowers in their country house in Lipčice, and that keeps her hope alive and enables her to find meaning. So I think that, and then in terms of general survival, I would say that it's probably quite useful to think outside the box and do things that that are unexpected and that baffle your persecutors if you're being persecuted or anyways. But I don't know if that answers the question, but what I hope remains is it's really corny and it's possibly my South American side, but what I hope remains is just love, really.
Well, it's a magnificent work told with love and incredible, as I said earlier, just the care with which you've crafted it, written it, told it. So I encourage all of you to read it. It will be coming out in paperback, yes, shortly.
November 3rd.
What's the date?
November 3rd.
November 3rd, fantastic. It'll be available in paperback. And again, it's Ariana Neumann, magnificent work, When Time Stopped. Ariana, thank you so much for being here tonight in England. And thank you to everybody who has joined us for this program. So, adios. Thank you.
Answer the question, please email me. I'm easy to find. I have a website, and just email me any questions you have. I love connecting to people. So thank you. Thank you very much, Barbara. You've been wonderful as always.
Well, anytime. Thank you, Ariana. Take good care. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.